and the police even discovered that it took 3 officers to pull off the cover. So Timothy couldn't have done that on his own. I mean, now there is another question here. Did he have some accomplices? So obviously he was questioned again, and when he was questioned again, he changed his story. This time he said that John Christie, remember his neighbor, offered to perform an abortion on Beryl. He didn't mention John in his first statement to protect him because at that time abortion in the UK was illegal. According to Timothy, after a few talks with Beryl, they both agreed to allow John to carry on with the abortion. John had said that he trained as a doctor before World War II and showed Timothy a medical textbook as proof of his credentials, a book which is kind of obvious that Timothy couldn't actually read. John then offered to perform an abortion on Beryl, so she and John scheduled the procedure for the next day. At first, Timothy didn't really agree with John, performing this abortion, but somehow Beryl managed to convince him by saying that they can't afford to have a baby, and this would kind of be the only way, right? On 8th of November, Timothy, he returned home from work when he was told by John that the abortion didn't work and Beryl sadly was dead. John had been waiting for Timothy at the bottom of the communal staircase, saying it's bad news, and it didn't work. Upstairs, Timothy found Beryl lying on their bed, dead, according to John, from septic poisoning. Baby Geraldine, she was alive and she was unhurt in her cot. John said that he would get rid of Beryl's body while Timothy was at work the next day. Because Beryl died during an illegal abortion, the police couldn't know what happened to her. John would then send baby Geraldine to an unnamed couple in East Acton who would look after her. He advised Timothy to sell off his furniture to raise what money he could and then leave London. In shock, Timothy did as he was instructed. And that's how, on 14th of November, he left for Wales to stay with relatives. Timothy said that he later returned to 10 Rillington Place to ask about his baby Geraldine, but John refused to let him see her. As a result of this second statement, the police performed a preliminary search of 10 Rillington Place, but they couldn't find anything incriminating, even though they did find a human thigh bone supporting a fence post in the garden. So I don't know how they didn't consider this any kind of incriminating, because I didn't really see anyone using a human bone to support a fence. But anyway, after a thorough search on 2nd of December, the police found the body of Beryl Evans wrapped in a green tablecloth in the wash house in the back garden behind a stack of timber boards. Access to the locked wash house was only possible using a knife kept by John's wife. But police was actually in for a surprise, because the body of baby Geraldine was sadly also found alongside Beryl's body. Timothy never said anything about killing his baby in any of the statements that he gave to police. Beryl and Geraldine, they had both been strangled. Beryl had absolutely no signs of having had an abortion, nor there was any evidence of any attempt of an abortion. So I think it's safe to say that John's story didn't make much sense about the abortion, because you don't really need to strangle someone to perform an abortion, right? The neck has nothing to do with the private area. Although the police examined the garden, they didn't find any traces of any skeletal remains, which were, if you are wondering, later discovered to be other victims of John the neighbor. They were in shallow graves, so it's strange that they were not found at the time, because they were in the same area where Beryl and Geraldine were found. So, and also they were not buried very deep, so it was kind of hard to miss them if the police would have done a thorough search. One of John's victims, Miss Edie, had her skull removed by John when his dog actually dug the body up from the garden. John then disposed of the skull in a bombed-out building nearby. This evidence was also ignored when the skull was later discovered by children who were playing in the ruins, and this skull was handed in to police. When Timothy was shown the clothing taken from the bodies of his wife and their baby, he was also informed that both of them had been strangled. According to his statement, this was the first time that he found out that his baby was killed. When asked by police if he was responsible for the death of his wife and baby, he apparently said that yes, he was the one responsible. He then confessed to strangling Beryl during an argument over debts, then strangling Geraldine 2 days later, and then going to Wales. Which, reading this, and after all my research and things, I find that Timothy is kind of trying to say what he indeed expects the police want to hear rather than the truth, right? Maybe he just wants to please, or is this maybe part of his wild stories? Maybe he didn't really comprehend the seriousness of the situation. I mean, at one point, he also said when the police told him that his wife and Geraldine, the baby, they were strangled with a rope or a cloth or something like that. He then said that that's what he used. So again, this confession, along with other contradictory statements that Timothy made during the police interrogation, kind of made police believe that he was guilty, or maybe that's what they wanted to see, maybe to close the case and just get it done with, because we'll get into more details later on. So later on, after this whole thing, several authors who wrote about this case argued that police provided Timothy with all of the necessary details for him to make a credible confession, which they may have in turn edited further while they were transcribing it. Which kind of seems like the case, doesn't it? This is like with the leading questions interviews, when police is asking you a leading question, kind of giving you the answer to the question in their question. On top of that, police interrogated Timothy over the course of the late evening and early morning hours. He had already spent 2 days in isolation in his hometown in police custody before he was transferred to the police in London. Already being in a highly emotional state, this was kind of bad for him physically and emotionally. Timothy said later in court that he believed he would be subjected to violence by the police if he didn't confess. He was also in shock after finding out that both his wife and baby were strangled. Now, there was also the police investigation, like I mentioned a bit earlier. It was just a disaster. There was a lack of forensic expertise, and significant evidence was overlooked. The Psychology of Interrogations and Confessions Handbook, published in 2003, states that some of the phrases of Timothy's confession, they sounded more like a language a police officer would use rather than the language used by someone who could barely write or speak properly. Timothy was kept, like I said, in solitary confinement for 2 days before he was handed over to the police in London. He had no idea what was going on, other than his wife's body wasn't found in the drain as expected and as he told them. At Notting Hill police station, he was shown his wife's and his daughter's clothing and the ligature used to strangle his baby. The handbook cites Ludovic Kennedy, who was a journalist, as a source for the conclusion that Timothy felt a lot of guilt over not doing more to prevent the deaths of his wife and baby, and particularly that his baby's murder must have been a tremendous shock. As part of the investigation, police obtained the employees register at Timothy's workplace. This could have given Timothy an alibi, but go figure. Guess what? The register somehow got lost. Those children playing in the nearby bomb site who handed police the skull they found was also ignored. There were builders making repairs at Timothy's house in November. They stored their tools in the wash house, but none of them saw any bodies. But police re-interviewed them, believing that they got confused, and so then persuaded them to amend their statements. These witnesses were not summoned to give evidence later in court. Timothy Evans was put on trial for the murder of his baby Geraldine on 11th of January 1950 before Mr. Justice Lewis and the jury. In accordance with the law at the time, the prosecution proceeded only with a single charge of murder, the murder of Geraldine. Beryl's murder, with which Timothy was still formally charged, was not formally before the court, even though evidence that he murdered Beryl was used with the purpose of establishing his guilt of the murder of Geraldine. Timothy, represented by Malcolm Morris, withdrew his confession during consultations with his solicitor and alleged that John Christie was responsible for the murders, in line with his second statement given to the police in his hometown in Wales. This was dismissed by the court as a fantastic allegation, and even though Timothy's solicitors warned him that it would be difficult to prove, he maintained this defense until his execution. John Christie and his wife Ethel were key witnesses for the prosecution. John denied that he offered to abort Beryl's unborn child and gave detailed evidence about the arguments between Timothy and his wife. The defense was trying to show that John was the murderer, highlighting his past criminal record. John had previous convictions for several thefts and malicious wounding. The malicious wounding involved John striking a woman on the head with a cricket bat. John was also a World War I veteran whose eyesight and vocal cords had been permanently affected in a gas attack. He served as a war reserve policeman during World War II, despite having been arrested several times in the 1920s and the 1930s for theft and assault. He and his wife Ethel had been married since 1919, but they separated for 10 years. Shortly after they got back together in 1938, they moved into Rillington Place. In his testimony at Timothy's trial, John Christie, of course, denied all of Timothy's accusations. He and his wife Ethel, they both testified to the couple's frequent fights and to hearing a loud thud coming from the Evans' flat the night of November the 8th, the last day that Beryl and Geraldine were seen alive. John's apparent change in behavior and his service with the police as a special constable probably, should I say, impressed the jury. The defense couldn't find a motive either for which a respected person like John Christie would murder two people. At the same time, the prosecution could use the explanation in Timothy's confessions as motive. Timothy had no previous convictions for violence. He had only been fined for theft and motoring offenses. But sadly, Timothy's conflicting statements undermined his credibility. Timothy took the stand in his own defense. He was actually the only witness called by his defense. Again, he denied killing Beryl and Geraldine, sticking to the version of events in his second confession. He further testified that he only became aware of his daughter's death when he was told about this by the police. Asked why he confessed to killing his family, Timothy said, "When I found out about my daughter being dead, I was upset and I did not care what happened to me then." The case largely came down to John's word against Timothy's. The trial lasted for only 3 days, and a lot of key evidence was left out or never even shown to the jury. So, Timothy Evans was found guilty, the jury reaching the decision in only 35 minutes. There was an appeal, but this appeal failed. This was held before the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Goddard, Mr. Justice Sellers, and Mr. Justice Humphreys on 20th of February. In the end, Timothy was executed by hanging on 9th of March 1950 by Albert Pierpoint, assisted by Sid Durnley at Pentonville Prison. 3 years later, the safety of Timothy's conviction was severely criticized when John's murders were discovered. During interviews with police and psychiatrists before his execution, John Christie admitted several times that he was responsible for the murder of Beryl Evans, Thomas's wife. If this was true, then Timothy's second statement detailing John's offer to abort Beryl's baby is likely to be the true version of events. Ludovic Kennedy, who was cited in the handbook that I mentioned earlier, provided one possible reconstruction of how the murder took place, saying that Beryl, she let John into her flat expecting the abortion to be carried out, but she was instead attacked and then strangled. John claimed to have possibly engaged in sexual intercourse with Beryl's body after her death, but he claimed to be unable to remember specific details. However, Beryl's post-mortem didn't find any evidence of sexual intercourse. In his confessions to Beryl's death, John denied that he agreed to carry out an abortion on Beryl. He instead claimed that he strangled her while intimate with her, or that she wanted to commit suicide and he helped her do it. Very credible, right? Something really important was not even mentioned in Timothy's trial. The two workmen, they were willing to testify that there were no bodies in the wash house when they worked there several days after Timothy was alleged to have hidden them. These workmen stored their tools in the washroom, which was a small outhouse measuring 54 by 52 inches or 140 by 130 centimeters, and they cleaned it out completely when they finished their work on 11th of November. But the workmen were never called to give evidence. Instead, the police re-interviewed them and forced them to change their evidence to fit the theory that Timothy was the murderer. John Kirsty, after everything, he actually ended up losing his job in the post office as a result of his criminal record being made public in court, and he struggled to find another job. Running out of money, he fraudulently sublet his flat in March 1953 and disappeared with the rent. After John left the flat, the landlord allowed an upstairs tenant, Beresford Brown, to use John's kitchen. And what a surprise comes next. Removing the wallpaper, Beresford found the bodies of three women, Kathleen Maloney, Rita Nelson, and Hectorina McLennan, hidden in a papered over kitchen pantry, a small space immediately next to the wash house where Beryl and Geraldine Evans were found. So, I think it's safe to say that John hid Beryl's and Geraldine's body in that same tiny space until the workmen left and then placed their bodies in the wash house. A further search of the building and the grounds turned up three more bodies. John's wife Ethel, under the floorboards of the front room, Ruth Furst, an Austrian nurse and munitions worker, and Muriel Eady, a former colleague of John Christie, who were both buried in the right-hand side of the small back garden of the building. John Christie even used one of their thigh bones to prop up a trellis in the garden, which, like I said, the police missed in their earlier searches of the property. So eventually, John Christie, he was arrested on 31st of March 1953, and during the course of the interrogation, he confessed 4 separate times to killing Beryl Evans. He never admitted killing baby Geraldine, however. He confessed to murdering Ruth Furst and Muriel Eady, saying that he stored their bodies in the washroom before he buried them in shallow graves in the garden, which again was missed at the first search. It was in the same washroom that the bodies of Beryl and Geraldine were found during the investigation into their murders. John Christie was found guilty of murdering his wife, and in the end he was hanged on 15th of July 1953 by Albert Pierpoint, the same hangman who executed Timothy Evans at the same prison just 3 years before. With his hands tied behind him, John complained as the noose was being lowered around his neck that his nose was itching. "It won't bother you for long," replied his hangman. Gosh, I can't even believe that I'm saying this. I mean, you are about to be hanged and you are complaining that your nose is itching? What kind of twist is this? That? Oh gosh. Because John's crimes, they raised doubts about Timothy's guilt in the murders of his wife and daughter. The serving Home Secretary David Maxwell Fyfe commissioned an inquiry to investigate the possibility of a miscarriage of justice. It was chaired by the Recorder of Portsmouth, John Scott Henderson, King's Counsel. This inquiry lasted 1 week, and guess what? The findings upheld Timothy's guilt in both murders, with the explanation that John's confessions of murdering Beryl Evans were unreliable because they were made in the context of supporting his defense that he was insane. Obviously, this didn't go well with the media and the public, because if John's confessions were unreliable, why should those of Timothy be acceptable, right? The inquiry ignored vital evidence and led to even more questions in Parliament, especially from Geoffrey Byng, Reginald Paget, Sidney Silverman, Michael Foot, and many other MPs. The murder of Beryl Evans was never a primary charge in the trials of either Timothy Evans or John Christie. Timothy had been charged with the murder of his daughter, and John with the murder of his wife. I don't know how it makes sense, but okay. By the late 1940s, capital punishment was becoming a major controversy in Britain. Just a year before Timothy's execution, the House of Commons heard during a debate that the only way an innocent man could conceivably be hanged would be if the police, the attorneys, the judge, and the jury had all gone collectively mad.